in the sleepy town of Millfield, Massachusetts. Autumn had arrived with a vengeance. In September 1910, the Elmwood Manor stood, like an aging sentinel against the harsh winds that swept down from the Berkshire Mountains. The estate belonged to the Harrington family, whose timber fortune had established them as local aristocracy for 3 generations. Elizabeth Harrington, the only daughter of William and Margaret, was to be married to James Montgomery, heir to a banking dynasty from Boston. The wedding was the social event of the season, with guests arriving from as far as New York and Philadelphia. Among the staff preparing for the celebration was Mary Sullivan, a 22-year-old servant girl who had worked at Elmwood for nearly 4 years. With auburn hair often hidden beneath her cap and eyes that betrayed an intelligence beyond her station, Mary had become an indispensable member of the household staff. "Mary, make sure the dining room silver is polished again before the guests arrive, Mrs. Patterson," the housekeeper ordered as she swept through the servants' quarters that morning. "Yes, ma'am," Mary replied, tucking a stray strand of hair back under her cap. The wedding was set for 3 o'clock that afternoon. By noon, the manor was transformed into a wonderland of flowers and finery. Elizabeth, resplendent in her ivory gown, requested something unusual just before the ceremony. "Mary," Elizabeth called as the servant girl passed by her dressing room, "would you stand with us for a photograph? You've been such a help to me these past years." Mary's eyes widened. "Miss Elizabeth, I couldn't possibly—" "Nonsense," Elizabeth insisted with a smile. "I wish it. James won't mind." And so it was that Mary Sullivan found herself standing slightly behind and to the right of the Newlyweds, as the photographer prepared his equipment in the manor's grand foyer. The flash powder ignited with a bright burst that momentarily blinded everyone present. "Perfect," the photographer declared. "Now, if the bride and groom would step into the garden for some outdoor portraits." As Elizabeth and James moved toward the garden doors, Mary slipped away to continue her duties. She needed to help serve champagne to the guests who were already mingling in the ballroom. The reception was in full swing by 5 o'clock. The champagne flowed freely and the orchestra played waltzes that filled the manor with music. It was during the cutting of the cake that Mrs. Patterson first noticed Mary's absence. "Has anyone seen Mary?" she asked the kitchen staff. No one had seen her since she had helped pass drinks nearly an hour earlier. By 6 o'clock, when the bride and groom were preparing to depart for their honeymoon, a discreet search of the manor had begun. By 7, when the last guests were leaving, William Harrington himself was informed that a servant girl had inexplicably vanished. "Check her quarters," he ordered. Perhaps she took ill, but Mary's small room in the servants' wing was undisturbed. Her few possessions remained in their places. Her second uniform hung on the hook beside the door. There was no note, no sign of packed belongings, nothing to suggest she had planned to leave. By midnight, the local constable had been summoned. By dawn, the search had expanded to include the grounds and the surrounding woods. Mary Sullivan had simply vanished. The only evidence that she had been present at all on that fateful day was her image in the wedding photograph standing quietly behind the happy couple. Her expression unreadable, forever captured in the moment before she disappeared. Constable Robert Fletcher was a methodical man who had served Millfield for 15 years without encountering anything more sinister than occasional drunkenness and petty theft. The disappearance of Mary Sullivan presented him with his first real mystery. "And you're certain she didn't mention plans to leave?" Fletcher asked Mrs. Patterson for the 3rd time as they sat in the housekeeper's private sitting room the day after the wedding. "Absolutely certain," Mrs. Patterson replied firmly. "Mary was reliable, Constable, not the type to abandon her post without a word." Fletcher scratched notes in his small leather-bound book. "What about family? Friends outside the manor?" "Her parents died in the influenza outbreak of '03. She has a brother somewhere out west Oregon, I believe, but they weren't close." As for friends, Mrs. Patterson hesitated. She kept to herself mostly, polite with the other staff, but not particularly close to anyone. Fletcher interviewed each staff member in turn. The gardener had seen Mary briefly around 4:30, carrying a tray of empty glasses back to the kitchen. A maid remembered passing her on the servants' staircase shortly after that. No one recalled seeing her after 5 o'clock. "What about the guests?" Fletcher asked William Harrington in the study later that afternoon. Harrington frowned. "I can't imagine any of our guests would have anything to do with the servant's disappearance." Constable: "Nevertheless, sir, I'll need a list of everyone who attended." Reluctantly, Harrington provided the guest list. Over the next week, Fletcher methodically interviewed those who remained in town, but none offered any useful information about Mary Sullivan. Meanwhile, the wedding photograph had been developed. Elizabeth and James Montgomery, now honeymooning in Europe, had no idea of the drama unfolding at Elmwood. In the photograph, they stood smiling at the center, while Mary Sullivan appeared behind them, her expression contrary to some later accounts, not unreadable but strangely serene, almost knowing. 2 weeks after the disappearance, Fletcher received a visit from Thomas Kelly, the delivery boy for Jameson's general store. "I didn't think it mattered at first," Thomas explained nervously, twisting his cap in his hands. "But I remembered something about Mary." "Go on," Fletcher encouraged. "About a month ago I was delivering groceries to Elmwood, and I saw Mary talking to a man at the edge of the property. They seemed familiar with each other. Did you recognize this man?" Thomas shook his head. "Never seen him before. Tall fellow, well-dressed. Not from around here." This new information led Fletcher to dig deeper into Mary's past. He discovered that before coming to Elmwood, she had worked briefly for a family in Boston, the Winthrops. When contacted, Mrs. Winthrop revealed that Mary had left their employ suddenly after an incident involving their eldest son. He developed an inappropriate attachment to her, Mrs. Winthrop explained stiffly in her response to Fletcher's inquiry. "We found it best to dismiss her." The investigation took an unexpected turn when Fletcher learned that Albert Winthrop had been a guest at the Harrington-Montgomery wedding. When questioned, Albert admitted to speaking briefly with Mary but denied any further interaction. "It was a coincidence that she worked here," he insisted. "I simply expressed surprise at seeing her. Nothing more." Without evidence to suggest foul play, the investigation stalled. Some in town began to speculate that Mary had simply seized an opportunity to escape service, perhaps with the help of an accomplice. Others whispered darker theories. As October turned to November, the mystery of Mary Sullivan's disappearance remained unsolved. But the photograph, with its 3 subjects, one of whom had vanished before the day was done, began to take on an almost mythical quality in the stories told throughout Millfield. On December 15, 1910, Elizabeth and James Montgomery returned from their extended European honeymoon to take up residence in their new home in Boston. The disappearance of Mary Sullivan had become a distant concern, mentioned only occasionally in letters from Elizabeth's parents. Snow-blanketed Boston as their carriage pulled up to their townhouse on Beacon Hill. The staff lined up to greet their new master and mistress, faces eager and curious. "Welcome home, Mrs. Montgomery," the housekeeper, Mrs. Collins, said with a curtsy. As Elizabeth was shown through her new home, she paused at the sight of a familiar face among the housemaids. "Mary?" she gasped. The girl turned, revealing a face that was indeed remarkably similar to Mary Sullivan's, but with subtle differences, her eyes a shade lighter, her jaw slightly squarer. "No, ma'am. I'm Catherine Walsh," the girl replied, curtsying deeply. Elizabeth shook her head, embarrassed by her mistake. "Forgive me. You reminded me of someone who worked for my parents." That night, as James slept beside her, Elizabeth found herself unable to rest. The resemblance between Catherine and Mary was uncanny, too uncanny to be coincidental. The next morning, she questioned Mrs. Collins about Catherine's background. "She came highly recommended from the Aldridge family, ma'am. Started 2 weeks ago, just before your return, and who specifically recommended her?" Mrs. Collins hesitated. "Well, it was Mr. Montgomery's mother who suggested her." "Ma'am?" Elizabeth felt a chill that had nothing to do with the December air. Her mother-in-law had been particularly insistent that they hire staff of proper background and temperament. During the following week, Elizabeth observed Catherine carefully. The girl performed her duties flawlessly but maintained a distance from the other staff. Once Elizabeth caught her staring at a framed copy of the wedding photograph that sat on the mantel in the drawing room. On December 23rd, Elizabeth decided to confront her husband with her suspicions. "James, did your mother arrange for Catherine to work here because she resembles Mary Sullivan?" James looked up from his newspaper, his expression unreadable. "What a strange question, Elizabeth." "It's not strange at all. The resemblance is remarkable, and your mother was oddly specific about staffing our home before we returned." James sighed and set aside his paper. "My mother has always been particular about appearances. Perhaps she thought having a pretty maid would please you." The answer didn't satisfy Elizabeth, but she let the matter drop temporarily. That night she woke to find James's side of the bed empty. From downstairs came the murmur of voices. Wrapping herself in a robe, Elizabeth crept down the staircase. The voices came from James's study, her husband's and another's, feminine and familiar. Through the barely opened door, Elizabeth could see James standing with his back to her. Across from him stood Catherine, but her posture had changed entirely, no longer servile but confident, almost commanding. "It can't continue like this," Catherine was saying, her voice transformed. It was Mary's voice, but harder, colder. "I've fulfilled my part of the bargain. When will you fulfill yours?" "You ask too much," James replied tersely. The agreement was for employment and protection, nothing more. Catherine, or was it Mary, laughed bitterly. "Protection? Is that what you call forcing me to change my name, my appearance, to become a shadow in your household? After what your family did?" Elizabeth must have made a sound, for both heads turned toward the door. James's face paled as he saw her. "Elizabeth," he began, but she was already backing away. "What have you done?" she whispered. "What have you done to Mary?" She turned and fled up the stairs, her husband's footsteps pounding behind her. As she reached their bedroom, his hand caught her arm. "You don't understand," James insisted, his fingers digging into her flesh. "Mary Sullivan became a liability. My family. We protect our interests. She's not dead," Elizabeth realized aloud. "You forced her to change her identity to work for us. Why?" James's expression hardened. "Some secrets must remain buried, Elizabeth. For everyone's sake." In that moment, Elizabeth saw her husband clearly for the first time, not the charming, principled man she thought she had married, but someone capable of extinguishing another human's identity to protect family secrets. And she wondered what secrets could possibly be worth such a price. The holiday season at the Montgomery townhouse passed in a fog of strained politeness and unspoken accusations. Elizabeth maintained appearances in public, but grew increasingly isolated within her marriage. James acted as if their confrontation had never occurred, while Catherine or Mary performed her duties with mechanical precision, never acknowledging any prior connection to Elizabeth. On New Year's Eve, the Montgomerys hosted a dinner party for Boston's elite. Among the guests were James's parents, Harold and Vivian Montgomery. Elizabeth watched her mother-in-law with new suspicion, noting how the woman's eyes occasionally followed Catherine around the room. When the opportunity presented itself, Elizabeth cornered her father-in-law in the library. "Mr. Montgomery," she began, keeping her voice low, "I need to understand what happened to Mary Sullivan." Harold Montgomery's face remained impassive, but his knuckles whitened around his brandy glass. "I'm afraid I don't know who you're referring to, my dear. The servant from my parents' home who disappeared on my wedding day and has mysteriously reappeared in my house under a new name." Harold sighed and set down his glass. "Elizabeth, there are matters within families, particularly families of our standing, that sometimes require discretion. Discretion doesn't explain why a young woman was forced to abandon her identity." Harold's expression hardened. "Some questions are better left unasked, particularly by a new bride. James is a good man from a good family. That should be enough for you." Elizabeth realized she would get nothing from her father-in-law. As the evening wore on, she observed the dynamics between the Montgomerys with increasing clarity. There was tension beneath the polished veneer, particularly between James and his father. After the guests departed and James retired to his study for a nightcap, Elizabeth made a decision. She went to the servants' quarters and knocked on Catherine's door. The maid opened it, her face carefully blank. "Yes, ma'am?" "Mary," Elizabeth said quietly. "I know it's you. I want to help." For a long moment, Catherine maintained her facade. Then, almost imperceptibly, her posture changed. "You can't help me," she replied, her voice no longer carrying the affected accent she'd adopted as Catherine. "None of us can escape what they've built." "What did they do to you? Why this elaborate charade?" Mary glanced nervously down the hallway. "Not here. Tomorrow. The public garden at noon. I'll find a way to be there." The next day, Elizabeth made an excuse about shopping and escaped to the public garden. Snow covered the ground and few people braved the cold. She waited by the pond, now frozen over, her breath forming clouds in the winter air. Mary appeared, dressed in a plain coat that Elizabeth recognized as one she had discarded last season. Her hair was hidden beneath a woolen hat. They'd been involved in legal schemes for decades, money laundering mainly. Elizabeth felt cold that had nothing to do with the January air. "And you discovered this?" Mary nodded. "At Elmwood before your wedding. I overheard a conversation between James and his father in the library. They were discussing using your father's timber business as a front for cleaning money from their operations, and they discovered you had overheard them. James saw me. I tried to pretend I hadn't heard anything, but double quotes." Mary shuddered. "After the wedding photo, Harold Montgomery cornered me in the hallway, said he needed to speak with me urgently. I thought he was going to threaten me, but it was worse. What did he do? He offered me a choice: disappear permanently or work for them under a new identity where they could keep me close, keep me watched. If I refused, he said my brother in Oregon would suffer an unfortunate accident." Elizabeth felt sick. "So you agreed. They smuggled me out during the reception, kept me hidden until they could create a new identity. Your mother-in-law orchestrated the whole thing, finding someone who resembled me enough to replace me in your household. And my parents? Did they know anything about this?" Mary shook her head. "Your father's business is legitimate as far as I know. The Montgomerys just planned to use it." A church bell sounded in the distance. Mary tensed. "I have to go. They time my errands." "I'll find a way to expose them," Elizabeth promised. Mary grabbed her arm. "Don't. They're powerful, with connections everywhere. If you try to fight them directly, you'll lose. As Mary hurried away, Elizabeth remained by the frozen pond, the foundations of her world crumbling beneath her feet. She had married into a family of criminals, and now she was trapped, just as surely as Mary Sullivan. January gave way to February, and Elizabeth began her own careful investigation. She started keeping a journal, documenting conversations and observations that might later serve as evidence. She also developed a system of communication with mere small notes hidden in the pages of books that Elizabeth asked to be delivered to her room. James noticed his wife's increasing withdrawal, but attributed it to the difficulty of adjusting to married life. He attempted to win her back with gifts and attention, unaware that each gesture only heightened her suspicion and resolve. One evening in mid-February, James announced he would be traveling to New York on business for several days. "Perhaps the time apart will do us good," he suggested, kissing her cheek before departing. With James away, Elizabeth seized the opportunity to search his study. The room was meticulously organized, with financial ledgers arranged chronologically on the bookshelves and correspondence filed in a locked desk drawer, a lock she had secretly learned to pick during her solitary afternoons. For hours, Elizabeth pored over the documents, most of which appeared legitimate at first glance. It was only when she compared certain transactions across multiple ledgers that discrepancies began to emerge. Sums that didn't match, businesses that existed only on paper, patterns of deposits and withdrawals that made little commercial sense. In a hidden compartment beneath the desk blotter, she discovered a small key. It didn't match any lock in the study, but Elizabeth suspected it might open something in the basement, a part of the house she rarely visited. That night, after the household had retired, she crept downstairs with a candle. The basement was divided into several room storage areas, the coal room and a wine cellar. It was toward the latter that Elizabeth headed, remembering James's pride in the collection he had inherited from his grandfather. The wine cellar was cool and dimly lit by her candle. Rows of bottles lined custom-built racks along 3 walls. The 4th wall held a large cabinet, ostensibly for storing glasses and decanters. Elizabeth approached it, noticing that unlike the rest of the cellar, which bore a fine layer of dust, the cabinet showed signs of regular use. The small key fit perfectly into a nearly invisible keyhole on the cabinet's side. And inside, instead of glassware, she found a safe. This she could not open, but the cabinet itself contained several folders hidden behind a false panel. Elizabeth's hands trembled as she opened the first folder. Inside were documents detailing property purchases throughout New England, properties that had changed hands multiple times within short periods, each time at significantly inflated prices. Accompanying the deeds were notes in a handwriting she recognized as Harold Montgomery's, outlining how each transaction had been used to convert funds from M into legitimate assets. The second folder contained something even more damning: a list of names, dates, and amounts. Some names were marked with an X. With growing horror, Elizabeth realized she was looking at a record of blackmail payments. One name near the bottom of the most recent page stood out: Sullivan, M. Next to it was written, "Contained permanent arrangement made." Footsteps above made Elizabeth jump. Quickly, she returned the folders to their hiding place, locked the cabinet, and extinguished her candle. Heart pounding, she made her way back upstairs, nearly colliding with Mary in the darkened hallway. "Mrs. Montgomery," Mary whispered, startled. "I heard noises. I thought perhaps an intruder." Quotes. "No intruder," Elizabeth assured her. "Just a wife discovering the truth about her husband's family." The following morning, Elizabeth visited her father at his Boston office. William Harrington was surprised but pleased by his daughter's unexpected appearance. "To what do I owe this pleasure?" he asked after embracing her. Elizabeth chose her words carefully. "Father, have you entered into any new business arrangements with the Montgomerys recently?" William looked surprised. "As a matter of fact, Harold has proposed a rather significant investment in our lumber operations out west. Why do you ask?" "I'm concerned," Elizabeth said, maintaining a calm she didn't feel. "I've noticed some irregularities in the Montgomery finances." William's expression grew serious. "What sort of irregularities?" "I believe they may be using legitimate businesses to launder money from less reputable sources." Her father stared at her for a long moment. "Elizabeth, these are extremely serious accusations. Do you have proof?" "Not yet," she admitted. "But I'm close." William ran a hand through his graying hair. "I'll delay any agreements with Harold until we can be certain, but Elizabeth, be careful. If what you're suggesting is true, you could be in danger." As Elizabeth left her father's office, she felt eyes upon her. Glancing across the street, she saw a man watching her, a man she recognized as one of Harold Montgomery's associates from the New Year's Eve party. The The Montgomerys were having her followed. The game had suddenly become much more dangerous. March arrived with unseasonable warmth that melted the snow and revealed the first tentative signs of spring. Elizabeth's investigation had yielded more evidence of the Montgomerys' criminal enterprises, which she carefully documented and hid in a compartment behind a loose brick in her dressing room. James had grown increasingly distant, spending more time at his office and less at home. When they did speak, their conversations were stilted and formal. Elizabeth suspected he knew something of her activities, but was uncertain how much. One evening, as Elizabeth sat in the drawing room pretending to read while actually making notes in her journal, James entered unexpectedly. He stood watching her for a moment before speaking. "My mother will be joining us for dinner tomorrow," he announced. "She specifically requested that the new maid Catherine serve us personally." Elizabeth kept her expression neutral. "Of course. I'll inform Mrs. Collins." James lingered, studying his wife's face. "Elizabeth, are you happy in our marriage?" The question caught her off guard. "Happiness is a complex thing, James." "Indeed." He moved closer, taking the book from her hands. "And loyalty is a simple one." His fingers brushed against the journal hidden within the book's pages. For a terrible moment, Elizabeth thought he would discover it, but he merely placed the book on the side table. "Whatever you think you know," James said quietly. "Whatever you think you're doing, stop. For your own sake." The threat, though veiled, was unmistakable. After James left the room, Elizabeth retrieved her journal with trembling hands. She needed to accelerate her plans. The following evening, Vivian Montgomery arrived precisely at 7. Dinner was an excruciating affair, with conversation limited to local gossip and the upcoming social season. Mary, still playing the role of Catherine, served silently, her eyes downcast. As dessert was being cleared, Vivian placed a hand on Elizabeth's arm. "My dear, you seem troubled. Marriage can be an adjustment, of course, but you mustn't let it affect your health." "I'm quite well, thank you," Elizabeth replied stiffly. Vivian's smile didn't reach her eyes. "I wonder. James tells me you've been visiting your father's office, asking questions about family business matters." Elizabeth felt a chill. A daughter's interest in her father's affairs is hardly unusual. "No, but a wife undermining her husband's family certainly is." Vivian's grip tightened slightly. "The Montgomerys have survived for generations because we understand the importance of family loyalty. Outsiders who threaten that loyalty rarely fare well." Elizabeth met her mother-in-law's gaze. "Is that what happened to Mary Sullivan? She threatened family loyalty?" A flicker of surprise crossed Vivian's face before her composure returned. "I don't know what you mean." "The servant girl who disappeared. A regrettable situation, but hardly relevant to our discussion." Mary, who had returned with coffee, froze momentarily before continuing her duties. The slight hesitation did not go unnoticed by Vivian, whose eyes narrowed thoughtfully. After dinner, James escorted his mother to her carriage. When he returned, his expression was thunderous. "What game are you playing, Elizabeth?" he demanded. "Mentioning that servant girl to my mother." "I merely asked a question," Elizabeth replied, maintaining her composure despite her racing heart. James gripped her shoulders. "Listen to me carefully. My family has worked too hard and too long to build what we have. If you persist in this investigation of yours, there will be consequences." "Are you threatening me, James?" "I'm trying to protect you," he insisted, though his fingers dug painfully into her flesh. There are things you don't understand. Forces you shouldn't challenge." "I understand more than you think," Elizabeth replied coldly. "I know about the properties, the blackmail, the money laundering. I know what your family did to Mary Sullivan, what you're still doing to her." James released her abruptly, his face pale. "You've made a grave mistake," he said after a long moment. "One I may not be able to shield you from." That night, Elizabeth lay awake, listening to James's measured breathing beside her. She had shown her hand too soon, pushed too hard. Now she needed to move quickly before the Montgomerys could silence her as they had silenced Mary. Shortly before dawn, a soft knock came at her dressing room door. Elizabeth rose carefully, not wanting to wake James. Mary stood in the hallway, her face ashen. "Mrs. Montgomery is still here," she whispered urgently. "She never left. I saw her speaking with the coachman. He drove away empty. She's in the guest room, and I overheard her on the telephone just now. She was arranging something for tomorrow night. Something about handling the situation permanently." Elizabeth felt cold dread settle in her stomach. "We're out of time," she realized aloud. "We need to take what evidence we have to the authorities today." Mary shook her head frantically. "They have people in the police department." "Your evidence will disappear, and so will we. Then we'll go to my father," Elizabeth decided. "Together, this morning, before anyone realizes what we're doing." As the first light of dawn crept across Boston, 2 women slipped out the service entrance of the Montgomery townhouse, carrying nothing but a small valise containing damning evidence against one of the city's most powerful families. Behind them, in the growing light, the house stood silent, its secrets momentarily left unguarded. But secrets, like shadows, have a way of following those who try to escape them. The morning mist still clung to the streets of Boston as Elizabeth and Mary made their way toward the Harrington offices on State Street. They took a circuitous route, frequently changing direction and watching for signs of pursuit. Elizabeth had dressed plainly, without the finery that would mark her as a Montgomery bride, while Mary had abandoned her maid's uniform for a simple dress borrowed from Elizabeth's wardrobe. "We need to hurry," Elizabeth urged as they turned onto a busier thoroughfare. "Once they discover we're gone, they'll come after us," Mary finished grimly, "and they won't be merciful." The city was coming to life around them, shop owners unlocking their doors, delivery boys making their rounds, workers hurrying toward factories and offices. Elizabeth found herself envying their ordinary concerns, their lives untouched by the darkness she had discovered. As they approached State Street, Elizabeth noticed a familiar figure standing outside her father's building, Harold Montgomery, engaged in conversation with a man she recognized as Detective Collins from the Boston Police Department. Her steps faltered. "They're already there," she whispered, pulling Mary into the recessed doorway of a nearby bookshop. "My father-in-law and a police detective." Mary's face paled. "Tsk. They knew we would come here. We need another plan." Elizabeth's mind raced. "My father has a small hunting cabin in Vermont. Few people know about it. We could go there, regroup, find another way to expose them. How would we get there? They'll be watching the train stations." Elizabeth considered their options. "My father's chauffeur, Mr. Parker. He's been with our family since I was a child. If we can reach him without being seen, he might help us." The Parker residence was in a modest neighborhood a mile from the Harrington home. The walk took nearly 40 minutes, during which Elizabeth constantly scanned their surroundings for Montgomery associates. Finally, they reached the small house where Thomas Parker lived with his wife. Mrs. Parker answered their knock, her eyes widening at the sight of Elizabeth. "Mrs. Montgomery? What a surprise. Is Thomas home?" Elizabeth asked urgently. "I need his help." Thomas Parker was a stoic man in his 50s who had served the Harrington family loyally for decades. When Elizabeth explained their situation, carefully omitting specific details that might endanger him, he didn't hesitate. "I'll take you to the cabin, Miss Elizabeth," he said, reverting to her maiden title, "but we'll need to be careful." "If these people are as dangerous as you say they are," Mary confirmed quietly. Parker's Model T was parked behind his house. "Wait here," he instructed. "I'll bring the automobile around front. Keep your heads down when you get in." As they waited for Parker to prepare the vehicle, Elizabeth noticed Mary staring out the window with an odd expression. "What is it?" she asked. "I never thought I'd see the day when you and I would be running for our lives together," Mary replied. "Strange how circumstances change us all." "Not all of us," Elizabeth said firmly. "Some reveal their true characters under pressure, while others merely confirm what they've always been." The journey to Vermont took most of the day. They avoided main roads where possible, stopping only once to refuel and purchase provisions. Parker remained vigilant throughout, frequently checking the road behind them for signs of pursuit. The Harrington cabin stood in a clearing surrounded by dense forest, 10 miles from the nearest town, built of sturdy logs with a stone chimney. It was rustic but comfortable, designed for William Harrington's occasional hunting trips with business associates. "I'll get a fire started," Parker said as they entered the cold interior. "Then I should return to Boston before my absence is noticed." "Thank you, Thomas," Elizabeth said, gripping his weathered hand. "I don't know how to repay you for this risk." Parker's expression softened. "Your father has been good to me and mine for many years, Miss Elizabeth. This is the least I can do." He hesitated. "What should I tell him?" "He'll be worried when he learns you've disappeared." Elizabeth considered. "Tell him we're safe, but don't say where. Just that I'll contact him when I can, and that he shouldn't trust the Montgomerys." After Parker departed, Elizabeth and Mary took stock of their situation. The cabin was well provisioned with canned goods and basic necessities. A small generator provided limited electricity, and there was a radio for weather reports and news. "We should be safe here for a while," Elizabeth said, though she couldn't quite believe it herself. Mary was less optimistic. "The Montgomerys won't stop looking. Men like Harold Montgomery don't allow threats to exist. Then we use the time we have wisely." Elizabeth opened the valise containing their evidence. "We need to organize everything, create a coherent narrative that explains their operation. Then we find a way to make it public somewhere beyond the reach of Montgomery influence." As night fell, the two women worked by lamplight, arranging documents and writing detailed explanations of the Montgomery schemes. Outside, snow began to fall, gradually blanketing the clearing and the dark forest beyond. The cabin creaked and settled around them, its isolation both a protection and a reminder of their vulnerability. Neither spoke of what might happen if the Montgomerys found them before they could expose the truth. Some fears were too overwhelming to voice aloud. 2 days passed at the cabin without incident. Elizabeth and Mary organized their evidence, prepared multiple copies, and discussed potential allies who might help them bring the Montgomerys to justice. On the third morning, Elizabeth woke to find Mary standing by the window, her posture tense. "Someone's coming," Mary said without turning around. Elizabeth joined her at the window. Through the trees, she could make out the dark shape of an automobile slowly navigating the narrow forest road toward the cabin. "How did they find us?" Elizabeth whispered, though she already suspected the answer. Few people knew about the cabin, and fewer still knew they had gone there. "It doesn't matter," Mary replied grimly. "They're here now. We need to hide the evidence." Working quickly, they concealed copies of their documents beneath floorboards, inside a hollow section of the chimney, and within the stuffing of an old chair. One set remained in the valise, which Elizabeth placed prominently on the table. "A distraction," she explained. "Let them think they've recovered everything." The automobile stopped outside, its engine falling silent. Through the frosted window, Elizabeth could make out 3 figures approaching Harold Montgomery. James and a third man she didn't recognize. "Elizabeth," James called out, his voice carrying in the crisp winter air. "We know you're in there. Open the door." Elizabeth exchanged a glance with Mary, then moved to the door. "Stay out of sight," she whispered before unlatching it. James stood on the porch, snow dusting his expensive coat. Behind him, Harold looked grim, while the unknown man, burly and watchful, hung back slightly. "Elizabeth," James said, his tone softening. "You've had us worried sick, have I?" Elizabeth replied coldly. "How did you find me?" "Thomas Parker has been in our employ for some time," Harold said, stepping forward. "Did you really think your father's chauffeur wouldn't report your activities to us?" The betrayal stung, though Elizabeth realized she should have been more cautious. The Montgomerys' influence clearly extended further than she had imagined. "Where's the servant girl?" Harold demanded, peering past Elizabeth into the cabin. Before Elizabeth could answer, Mary stepped into view. "I'm here," she said, her voice steady despite the fear Elizabeth could see in her eyes. James pushed past Elizabeth into the cabin, heading straight for the valise on the table. He opened it, quickly scanning the contents. "Is this everything?" "Yes," Elizabeth lied. "That's everything." Harold joined his son, examining the documents with a frown. "Foolish girl," he muttered. "Do you have any idea what you're meddling with? Criminal enterprises? Blackmail? Forcing innocent people to change their identities?" Elizabeth's voice rose. "Yes, I believe I understand perfectly." James slammed the valise shut. "You understand nothing. Our family maintains order in this city. Yes, we operate in gray areas sometimes, but for the greater good." "The greater good of your bank accounts," Mary interjected, earning a sharp look from Harold. "You should have stayed in your place, girl," Harold said coldly. "We gave you a comfortable position, protection. This is how you repay our generosity." Elizabeth laughed bitterly. "Generosity? You threatened her family and erased her identity." Harold turned to the burly man who had followed them in. "Mr. Donovan, secure the cabin. Make sure there are no other documents hidden anywhere." As Donovan began searching the cabin, upending furniture and tapping walls for hollow spaces, Harold addressed Elizabeth again. "I had such hopes for you, my dear. You come from good stock. Your father is a practical man who understands how the world works. I thought you would adapt to our family's ways. My father is nothing like you," Elizabeth spat. "He built his business honestly." Harold smiled thinly. "Is that what you believe? Ask him sometime about the lumber contracts in New Hampshire in '98. Ask him how he acquired the Westfield properties so cheaply." The insinuation that her father might be involved in similar schemes shook Elizabeth, but she refused to show it. "Even if that were true, it doesn't justify what you've done." James approached his wife, his expression softening. "Elizabeth, come home with me. We can forget this unfortunate episode. Start fresh." "And Mary, what happens to her?" James glanced at the servant girl dismissively. "That's not your concern. She disappears again," Elizabeth realized aloud. "Permanently this time." Harold's silence confirmed her suspicion. The older Montgomery checked his pocket watch impatiently. "This discussion is pointless. James, convince your wife to cooperate, or Mr. Donovan will need to take more drastic measures." As if on cue, Donovan paused in his search, turning toward the women with menacing intent. Elizabeth felt her heart racing but stood her ground. "You can't simply make us disappear," she said. "People will ask questions." "Tragic accident," Harold replied smoothly. "2 women alone in a remote cabin in winter. Perhaps a fire. These old structures are so vulnerable to accidents." The casual way he outlined their potential murder sent chills down Elizabeth's spine. She glanced at James, searching for any sign that he would oppose his father's plan, but his expression remained inscrutable. "James," she pleaded, Is this what you want? To be complicit in murder? For a moment something flickered in his eyes. Doubt, perhaps, or conflict. But Harold placed a hand on his son's shoulder, and the moment passed. Family comes first, Elizabeth, James said finally. It's always been that way. Mary, who had been silent during this exchange, suddenly moved toward the fireplace. If we're going to die anyway, she said, reaching for the poker, I have nothing to lose. Donovan moved quickly, grabbing her arm before she could grasp the improvised weapon. Mary struggled in his grip, her face contorted with fear and rage. Stop, Elizabeth cried. I'll cooperate. Just don't hurt her. Harold smiled coldly. A wise decision. James, take your wife to the automobile. Mister, Donovan will bring the servant girl and follow shortly. Elizabeth's mind raced as James gripped her arm, steering her toward the door. She knew what Harold's words meant. They would be separated, and Mary would never reach Boston alive. As they stepped onto the porch, a sound broke the winter stillness, the distant rumble of an approaching vehicle. All heads turned toward the forest road. Are you expecting someone? Harold demanded sharply. Elizabeth's heart leapt with sudden hope. Perhaps it's Thomas Parker returning to check on us. Harold's eyes narrowed suspiciously. Donovan, investigate. Before Donovan could move, a black Packard emerged from the trees, followed by a police automobile. The lead car stopped, and William Harrington stepped out, accompanied by a distinguished-looking man in an expensive coat. Father, Elizabeth called out, breaking free from James's grip and rushing down the steps. Harold moved to intercept her, but William's voice rang out clear and authoritative. Take your hands off my daughter, Montgomery. The man beside William stepped forward. Harold Montgomery, I'm Special Agent Lawrence Wilson with the Bureau of Investigation. We have some questions regarding certain banking irregularities. The color drained from Harold's face. This is a private family matter, Wilson. You have no jurisdiction here. Interstate fraud gives us plenty of jurisdiction, Wilson replied calmly. And Miss Sullivan's testimony provides us with probable cause. At the mention of Mary's name, Harold turned to glare at the servant girl, who had managed to free herself from Donovan's momentarily slackened grip. I sent letters, Mary explained, a hint of triumph in her voice. Before we left Boston, to William Harrington and to the Bureau office. Insurance, in case something happened to us. Elizabeth stared at Mary in astonishment. The quiet servant had outmaneuvered them all. The interior of William Harrington's Packard was blessedly warm as Elizabeth sat beside her father, watching through the window as federal agents took statements from Mary. Harold and James Montgomery stood near their automobile, their expressions stormy as Agent Wilson explained the situation to them in low tones. How did you know to bring the Bureau? Elizabeth asked her father. Williams's weathered face was grim. Mary's letter reached me the day after you disappeared. It contained enough evidence to warrant contacting the authorities. Though I admit I was skeptical at first. Harold suggested you might not be entirely innocent yourself, Elizabeth said carefully. Something about lumber contracts and the Westfield properties. Her father sighed heavily. The Montgomerys have been trying to entangle honest businessmen in their schemes for years. They approached me several times with proposals that skirted legality. I refused. He paused. But they're powerful, Elizabeth. They've ruined men who opposed them. Yet you came here, brought federal agents. You're my daughter, William said simply. No power or fortune is worth your safety. Outside, the confrontation appeared to be escalating. Harold's voice rose, though the words were indistinct through the closed windows. Agent Wilson remained impassive while James seemed to be attempting to mediate. What will happen to them? Elizabeth asked. That depends on the evidence and how far the Bureau wants to pursue this, William replied. Banking fraud is difficult to prove, particularly when the perpetrators have friends in high places. Elizabeth thought of the documents they had hidden throughout the cabin. There's more evidence inside. We made copies. William squeezed her hand. You've shown remarkable courage, Elizabeth, though I wish you had come to me sooner. I wasn't sure who to trust, she admitted. The Montgomerys seemed to have allies everywhere. The car door opened and Mary slid into the back seat, her face pale but composed. Agent Wilson says we'll need to provide formal statements in Boston. Are you all right? Elizabeth asked with concern. Mary nodded. Better than I've been in months. She glanced out the window at the Montgomerys. They didn't expect resistance, especially not from women they thought they controlled. The drive back to Boston was largely silent, each occupant of the car lost in their own thoughts. Elizabeth watched the snow-covered landscape pass by, wondering what would become of her marriage, her position in society, her future. The life she had imagined for herself had unraveled in mere months. At the Federal Building in Boston, Elizabeth and Mary spent hours providing detailed statements about the Montgomery operations. They produced the evidence they had gathered. explained the connections between seemingly legitimate businesses and illicit money flows, and detailed the threats and coercion they had experienced. It was nearly midnight when they finished. Agent Wilson thanked them for their cooperation but warned that the case was just beginning. The Montgomerys have resources and connections, he cautioned. This investigation could take months, even years, and they won't go quietly. What about our safety in the meantime? Elizabeth asked. We can provide some protection, Wilson replied, but it might be advisable for both of you to leave Boston for a while. William, who had waited patiently throughout the proceedings, nodded in agreement. I have business interests in Chicago. You could stay there until the situation resolves. As they left the federal building, exhausted but relieved, Elizabeth noticed a figure waiting beside a sleek automobile across the street. James. He stood alone, without his father or their enforcer. Wait here, she told her father and Mary, then crossed the street to confront her husband. James looked haggard, his usual Polish diminished by the day's events. Elizabeth, he began, but seemed unable to continue. Have you come to threaten me again? She asked coldly. He shook his head. My father has been arrested. The Bureau had more evidence than we realized, banking records going back years. Apparently they've been building a case for some time, and your testimony was the final piece they needed. Elizabeth felt no satisfaction at this news, only a profound weariness. And you? Are you under arrest as well? Not yet, James admitted, but it's likely only a matter of time. He ran a hand through his disheveled hair. I wanted to see you, to ask ... if there's any way to salvage something between us. Elizabeth studied the man she had married with new clarity. Did you know what they planned to do to Mary and me at the cabin? James couldn't meet her eyes. I wouldn't have let it come to that. But you stood by while your father threatened us. You were willing to let him frighten us, intimidate us, as long as it protected your family interests. I was caught between loyalty to my family and love for my wife, James said, a note of desperation in his voice. And loyalty won, Elizabeth concluded. As it always would, James. That's the truth I had to accept about you. She turned to leave, but James caught her arm. Elizabeth, please. People make mistakes. They can change. For a moment Elizabeth remembered the hopeful bride she had been, the future she had imagined with this man. Then she gently removed his hand from her arm. Some mistakes reveal character, James, and some changes come too late. As she walked back to where her father and Mary waited, Elizabeth felt a strange lightness despite the uncertainty ahead. Quote, the truth had been exposed, and with it came the possibility of building something new from the wreckage of what had been destroyed. Spring 1911, Chicago. Elizabeth sat at the writing desk in her father's Chicago residence, penning a letter to her mother in Massachusetts. Through the open window came the sounds of a city in perpetual motion: automobile horns, street vendors' calls, the distant whistle of trains. 3 months had passed since the confrontation at the Vermont cabin. The federal investigation into the Montgomery banking empire had expanded, revealing a network of fraud and corruption that reached into city governments, police departments, and even federal offices. Harold Montgomery remained in custody awaiting trial, while James had been indicted but released on bail, his involvement deemed less central than his father's. Divorce proceedings were underway. Though the scandal had already effectively ended Elizabeth's marriage in the eyes of Boston society, some former friends had distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with a woman who had helped bring down one of the city's most powerful families. Others had secretly expressed admiration for her courage. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Come in, she called. Mary entered, no longer dressed as a servant but in the practical attire of a working woman. In Chicago she had reclaimed her identity as Mary Sullivan and found employment as a clerk in William Harrington's Midwest office. The afternoon mail arrived, Mary said, placing several envelopes on the desk, including something from Boston you might find interesting. Elizabeth sorted through the correspondence, pausing at a thick envelope bearing the name of Hartwell Photography Studio, the business that had photographed her wedding. How odd, she murmured, opening it carefully. Inside was a note from Mr. Hartwell. Mrs. Montgomery, during our annual archive review, we discovered the enclosed photograph was never delivered to you due to the unfortunate circumstances following your wedding. Though belatedly, I thought you might wish to have it for historical purposes. Respectfully, Edward Hartwell. Elizabeth slid the photograph from the envelope and Mary moved to look over her shoulder. There in sepia tones was the moment forever frozen in time: Elizabeth in her wedding gown beside James, both smiling for the camera, and slightly behind them, Mary Sullivan. Her expression not serene or knowing as Elizabeth had remembered, but watchful, alert, as if already sensing the danger that would soon engulf her. It seems like another lifetime, Mary commented softly. Elizabeth studied the faces in the photograph, her own naive happiness, James's practiced charm, Mary's cautious vigilance. Three people connected by circumstances none of them could have predicted, their lives irrevocably altered by what followed. In many ways it was, Elizabeth agreed. We're different people now. Mary nodded thoughtfully. Do you regret it? Discovering the truth about the Montgomerys, even though it cost you your marriage and position? Elizabeth considered the question carefully. The past months had been difficult, the public scrutiny, the legal proceedings, the painful dissolution of what she had once believed would be her future. Yet along with those hardships had come unexpected freedoms and discoveries about her own strength. No, she said finally. Truth may be painful, but living a lie would have been unbearable. She glanced up at Mary. What about you? You lost everything because of what you overheard that day. Not everything, Mary replied with a small smile. I lost an identity that was forced upon me, but I gained something more valuable, my freedom and my voice. Elizabeth placed the photograph in the desk drawer. Unlike many Boston brides who displayed their wedding portraits prominently, she had no desire to commemorate that day. The photograph was a relic of the past, important as historical evidence, but not as a treasure to be preserved. Later that afternoon, Elizabeth walked with Mary through Lincoln Park, enjoying the spring sunshine. They had developed an unusual friendship, the former society bride and the former servant, now equals bound by shared experience and mutual respect. Agent Wilson telephoned yesterday, Elizabeth mentioned as they strolled along the lakeshore. The trial dates have been set for July. We'll need to return to Boston to testify. Mary's expression tightened slightly, but she nodded. I expected as much. Will you be ready to face them again? The Montgomerys, I mean. I believe so, Elizabeth replied. They seem less formidable now that their secrets have been exposed. She paused. The agent also mentioned something interesting, apparently. Several other families have come forward with similar stories about the Montgomerys. Women who were threatened or manipulated, businesses that were coerced into partnerships. They created quite a web, Mary observed. One that lasted for decades because people were too frightened to speak out. Until someone did, Elizabeth said, giving Mary a meaningful look. Mary shook her head modestly. We both did, and we paid prices for it. They walked in companionable silence for a time, watching children playing and couples strolling beneath the newly budding trees. Chicago represented a fresh start for both women, far from the stifling conventions of Boston society and the shadows of the Montgomery influence. Have you thought about what comes next? Mary asked eventually. After the trial, I mean. Elizabeth had indeed been contemplating her future. At 23, with a failed marriage and a public scandal behind her, the traditional path for a woman of her background was effectively closed. Yet rather than feeling limited, she found herself considering possibilities that would have seemed unthinkable a year ago. My father has suggested I might take a more active role in the family business, she said. He believes I've shown an aptitude for detecting financial irregularities. Mary laughed. A polite way of saying you're good at uncovering fraud. Perhaps, Elizabeth smiled, though I've also considered university studies. Women are making inroads in fields previously closed to them. Law, journalism, even finance. You'd excel at any of those, Mary said with genuine admiration. They reached a bench overlooking the lake and sat down. In the distance, ships moved across the water, connecting Chicago to distant ports and possibilities. And you? Elizabeth asked. Will you stay with my father's company? Mary considered the question. For now. The position offers security, which I value after everything that's happened. But I've been taking stenography classes in the evenings. There are opportunities for women with those skills in the courts and government offices. Elizabeth nodded approvingly. From household servant to government stenographer, quite a journey. From society bride to business analyst or lawyer, equally remarkable, Mary countered. They shared a smile of mutual understanding. Neither woman's path had been what they expected, but both had discovered strengths and possibilities through adversity. As the afternoon light began to fade, they rose to return to the Harrington residence. Elizabeth thought again of the wedding photograph that had arrived that morning, the moment captured just before everything changed. The servant girl who posed with the Newlyweds had indeed vanished before the wedding ended, but not in the way anyone might have predicted. In her place stood a woman who had helped expose corruption, who had refused to be silenced, who was building a new life on her own terms. And beside her walked another woman who had discovered similar courage within herself. The photograph had captured an ending disguised as a beginning. But here in the gathering dusk of a Chicago spring, something authentic was taking root. Two lives moving forward. No longer defined by the roles they had once been assigned, but by the choices they had made when confronted with difficult truths. Behind them, the sun set over Lake Michigan, casting long shadows across the park. Ahead lay uncertainties and challenges, but also possibilities neither woman would have imagined on that autumn day in 1910 when they had stood side by side, their futures seemingly predetermined, for a photograph that would document not just a wedding, but the beginning of an unexpected journey toward truth and liberation.